Welcome back to the Mental Health Toolbox podcast. I'm Patrick Martin, your host, teaching you ways to improve your mood, be more productive, and improve your quality of life so that you can worry less and do more. All right, so we are picking up with episode 3, and we'll be covering the third skill of the fundamental skills in cognitive behavioral therapy. In this skill set, we will be learning how to explore our thoughts to find out whether or not they hold any water. That is to say, whether our thoughts are valid or just being taken at face value. All right, and this is really important because if we don't challenge our thoughts, then we will never learn how to change them. And the CBT teaches us that not all of our thoughts are valid, and we'll be diving in this today. Okay, so let's get started.
Welcome to the Mental Health Toolbox podcast, where you will gain the knowledge to thrive. Here is your host, licensed psychotherapist, Patrick Martin.
All right, welcome back. And today we'll be talking about exploring the evidence for our thoughts. And so in this episode, I'll be covering how we talk back to our unhealthy thoughts, how we explore the evidence for our thoughts, how we learn to exchange distorted thoughts with helpful ones, and the Cbt Mantra, catch it, check it, change it. All right? So let's go ahead and start off with that first one, exploring the evidence. As I had mentioned in the previous episode, it is vital that we learn the habit of being mindful to the nature of our thoughts in correlation with our mood. And we have been discussing the use of mood and thought tracking to do this through the quick mood tracking tool that you can get through the website. If you just visit thementalhealthtoolbox.com, you can grab it right there if you already haven't done that. All right. So in this episode, we'll be going one step beyond thought tracking and moving into thought challenging, such as exploring the evidence for our thoughts. Learning to track your thoughts and your mood through the use of mood scales or a similar tool was a preliminary step that we learned in the last couple episodes. Now we'll be moving on and learning how to write them down and putting them into context. And when I say put them into context, what I really mean is put them in the hot seat. When we do this, we're really seeking out facts to find out whether the evidence supports or negates their claims. All right? And I kind of break it down into 4 steps here. So the first step is to write the thought down. So in your mood thought tracking tool or calendar or journal or your phone notes or whatever it is that you're using, when you notice a thought that lowers your mood, you want to write it down verbatim. So word for word. Specificity is the key here. The next step, step 2, is examining the thoughts. So the first step was writing it down. Second step is examining the thought. So when we do this, we're literally just listing the facts that support the truthfulness of the fault in the reasoning of the thought or statement, right? It sounds a little weird, right? So we're looking for the supporting truthfulness of the faults in the reasoning of the thought or statement. Now ask yourself if you believe the thought is either true or false. The third step is sharing your thought with another person. This is where the sounding board becomes really important, right? Somebody you trust, somebody who'll give you some direct feedback where you can bounce your ideas or beliefs off someone, all right? This could be a parent, a BFF, your therapist, a coach, a pastor, somebody that you think will give you some sound feedback or advice, or at least an objective angle on it, okay? Or perspective. It's not enough to take our own counsel. It's important to seek out someone whose opinion and judgment you trust and get their feedback on the thought. Or better yet, get more than one opinion. Take into account all of the evidence and come to your own determination. This is really important. It's easy to take the first thing somebody says and run with it and just assume that's gospel. Or even worse, go to someone who you think is going to tell you what you want to hear And then you can say, oh, see, I knew I was right. This is exactly what's going on. It's the worst case scenario. No. In fact, I would even encourage you to get more than one person's feedback. The more feedback you have, the better. There's an old proverb that says, a wise person surrounds himself with wise counsel. The idea there is you get enough various, diverse feedback that you can come to kind of a conclusion based off the mean, right? The average conclusion. Assuming that the average, if you get enough feedback, that you're going to find a rational explanation. We call this reality testing, right? So the fourth step here is to collect more evidence and test your theory. I know, sounds like work, right? Got to collect more evidence, but it's well worth the effort. It is perfectly normal to be divided on your own thoughts and concerns, right? To be divided or have different opinions about your own thoughts is perfectly normal, especially when there's not enough sufficient evidence or if the experience is very subjective, right? In these cases, it's best not to take your own counsel, but to kind of read the room, the environment, the context, right? And then get other people's objective opinions about it. Keeps us grounded. It's vital that you learn the importance of testing your assumptions. All right, just want to check in with you, make sure you're still with me, you're not multitasking, because we're kind of going to deep dive into this right here. And it does require a little bit of fortitude to really make sure that we're focusing in on the skill here, because it seems a little simple, when we think about, okay, so we have to examine the evidence for our thoughts, but the application gets a little more sticky, right? And I do appreciate you sticking with me here. At the time I'm recording this, it is 11:30 at night, so my apologies if you're getting my last fruits, not my first fruits, but first fruits go to my family, right? My kids had a doctor's appointment today. I could have, been podcasting, but I haven't missed a single doctor's appointment yet, and I don't plan to. So family first, right? Okay, so let's jump into it. So we just talked about the 4 steps of examining our thoughts. Let me give you an example to kind of put this into context. You want to ask for promotion at work. Your initial thought is, I would never be considered for a promotion because blank. You do the fact finding and are still unsure of how your request would be received. The only way to test your theory is to ask, apply, get feedback, and then reconsider your assumptions. That's right. We have to do the scary thing. We actually have to test and challenge our belief system. That's scary stuff. That means we actually have to put ourselves at social risk, right? Rejection, judgment, that kind of stuff. Our worst fears. In most cases, the initial negative or derogatory aspects of the thought are not valid, but you'll discover other meaningful feedback that provides you with a better understanding of what the obstacles actually are. Ding, ding, ding. That means you actually get meaningful feedback, or what we call actionable feedback. Actionable feedback from your environment in which you can kind of plan around and come back from a different angle to attack your obstacle. In turn, this will put you in a better position to adjust your thinking and approach around the subject to improve future outcomes by making informed decisions, as opposed to acting on unfounded assumptions. This actually holds true for most things that we feel anxious about, such as social acceptance, dating, occupational goals, and the like. All right, the next step here is to rate your thoughts. So after you feel that you have gathered adequate feedback from your environment, now you want to reassess and rate how helpful or unhelpful, accurate or inaccurate your initial thought was. Okay, so this leads us on to the next step, learning to locate a new thought to exchange for the old, unhelpful one. So that means if you find out that the thought that was making you anxious in the first place or depressed isn't based in reality. It's just stinking thinking, right? Future tripping. And you get yourself all worked up through analysis paralysis. And you find out that you're just spinning your wheels for no reason. All right, so we trashed that thought. Now what? Now we actually have to find out a more realistic thought to plug in. And this is where a lot of people get stuck. They think, oh, okay, so I know what the problem is now, but I don't know where to go from here. And this is actually when a lot of people enter into therapies, because they're halfway there, but they lose sight of what the next steps are. Okay, so I know what's wrong. I know these thoughts are not based in reality because my environment is telling me so. But it's still causing me problems, and I don't know how to put my life back together to get back on track. And so this is the tricky part. So let's talk application. So the application of this skill here is really about understanding that now that you're learning to be more mindful, it's time to take a moment to check in with your thoughts when you notice your mood is low, right? So that means when your body's sending you biofeedback that something's wrong, that your initial impulse is to kind of pause and find out what your thought process is, what's going on in your head when you're upset, depressed, anxious. The moment you notice that in your body, whether that's heart palpitations or sweaty palms or racing thoughts, or especially if it's like, causing insomnia and keeping you up at night. Like, okay, what were you just thinking? That should be easier, the less there is going on externally. For me personally, it's usually helpful to stop what I am doing in the moment and take a deep breath or two. Doing so helps me focus my attention on the present. Are you able to identify your thoughts? Do they feel helpful or unhelpful? Meaning, are they making your situation better? If not, probably need to replace them. Okay, so moving on to the next thing. We want to practice replacing our thoughts with helpful ones, all right? Do you notice your train of thought changing in relation to your new thought? You should. And if so, have you noticed your mood follow? Exploring the evidence for your thoughts is crucial in your mental health journey. Remember the ABCs of CBT we discussed? You will know if your replacement thought is a good choice because it will be accurate, balanced, and complete in its nature. Unhelpful thoughts will fall into one of the unhealthy thought patterns discussed in our previous episode, harmful thinking habits. Okay, so now we move on to the CBT Mantra. Catch it, check it, change it, right? So this is what I want you to remember anytime you're distressed, anxious, depressed. Just remember, catch it, check it, change it. Catch it, check it, change it, right? These are the three main steps we need to kind of kick into gear, and that kind of muscle memory, kind of behavior, action, response when we're triggered. Okay, so let's talk about the catch it part. The first step in improving your mood is to get faster at catching your unhelpful thoughts. That is why we have been using mood scales or some other method for tracking on paper to build that muscle. It's not something you have to do indefinitely. I would never encourage my clients to, write down their track their mood every single day of the rest of their life. That's not reasonable and it's not realistic. The whole purpose of doing a mood scale, track your mood and your thoughts, is to build the habit so you can do it in your head, right? So moving on. We are trying to improve our reaction time so that you catch it before it manifests into our mood and subsequent behavior and or speech. Remember also that even though feelings tend to follow our thoughts, feelings are easier to catch and are often our starting place. And then we work backwards to explore what we were thinking when we were triggered. So it goes back to the idea that, okay, our thoughts are fast, our thoughts are sneaky oftentimes and intrusive, and we can't catch our thoughts right away. What we usually can catch is our feelings. So we know what our feelings are. We know when we're feeling angry or mad or sad or anxious, these prime emotions. And so that's usually our tell, and then we have to pause and work backwards and kind of say, oh, what was I just thinking before I felt upset? Okay, well, what was going on? How did I feel about that? Okay, what was I thinking about that? Because we may not even be able to work directly back from our emotions. Oftentimes we have to say, okay, so and so just said that to me. So what did I think about that? What did I say back to that person? Why did I say that? What kind of tape or script was playing in my head? What was I anticipating? What was I scared of? These are the questions we have to ask ourselves to find ground zero with our thoughts. Okay, so that was the check it or catch it part. So now we're going to move on to the check it. Okay, so we talked about being accurate, complete, and balanced. All right, so that's where we do the checking part, right? So the inaccurate, we need to find out if this is a false thought. Is the thought false? A usual tell for this would be if the thought is very absolute or rigid or derogatory. If we're trying to find out if a thought is incomplete, we're usually looking for a half-truth. With these, we tend to focus only on a negative, partial assumption and leave pertinent facts out of the equation. Here's an example. A statement like, I failed in my marriage is very different from, my marriage failed because my partner and I could not come to terms after they had an affair, right? So one is a half fact, right? Or a very fractional fact. We're leaving out the bigger picture here. So when we're trying to find a more complete thought, we have to kind of paint the whole picture in the words we use. Now, if we're looking to see if a thought is balanced or unbalanced, well, no, because this is an extreme, exaggerated, and global view of the problem, usually in relation to ourselves. An example would say something like, nothing ever goes right for me, right? See, it's an overgeneralization of the problem and a negative skew. The take-home point here is really that if our thoughts are left unchecked and contain any of the facts we just mentioned, any of these factors of being inaccurate, incomplete, or unbalanced, then they are at greater risk of dragging our mood down. All right. So once we find out that our thoughts are unfactual, invalid, we have to figure out how to change it. And as mentioned earlier, once you have identified an unhelpful thought, we have to play it through and replace it with an accurate, balanced, and complete thought that serves us versus the thought that works against us. It is not enough to simply ignore our harmful thoughts, because then there's no actual change in the direction of our thought process. We have to learn to pivot. Okay, so now we have to talk about the practice. So how do we put the skills we just discussed into play, into practice? How do we do our homework, so to speak? So putting this stuff into practice will involve the catch it, check it, change it mantra that we just discussed. Okay, so we start off by listing the triggering event, or in CBT is often what's called the activating event or precipitating event, right? The thing that set us off or started the snowball rolling, okay? Could be an argument with a spouse, could be something very subtly said to you at work, could be somebody cutting you off in traffic. It could be that you started off your day stepping into, urine that your cat left on the floor, right? I mean, it could be anything. It doesn't even have to be directed at you intentionally. It could just be that the feeling the universe is working against you, or that you're, got off on the wrong side of the bed, so to speak, as people like to say. To which I say, get back in bed and get off the other side, right? At least that's what I say to myself. If something doesn't quite start right at the beginning of the day, a couple of weeks ago, I got up and our goldfish of umpteen years that I've been trying to save and, nurse back to health, was, floating lifeless, and it was not a great way to start the day. And I had to hit reset, after I circled back. I got my coffee and I went outside. It's only 5 or 10 minutes, and the mornings are rushed, getting ready for work and everything. But I made it a point. Go outside, sit in my chair, watch the sun over the mountains, and, take in the morning air and do some deep breathing. And it took 5 minutes, but it allowed me to kind of circle back and hit reset and, start the day right. And that is so important. And you'd think as a therapist, I'd remember this kind of stuff all the time, but, I'm human and life happens and I don't always remember to slow down and start over. But we get to do that. We have a choice. We get to choose at any time, at any point in the day to hit reset. And you can say that to somebody and it might seem rude. If somebody said that to me when I was upset, I'd be like, what are you talking about? Hit reset. Do you see what just happened to me? No. But we get to do that with ourselves. And if we learn to show some self-compassion and say, what happened just really sucks. I wish it didn't happen, but it did happen. And the only choice I have is how I respond and where I go from here. And that's it. But that's powerful. That is a superpower that we all have. We can choose how we react to our environment. We don't get to choose what happens to us all the time. Okay? So that's the first step here. Listing the triggering event. The next part is taking note of your feelings in response to the trigger. And we don't want to move past this part too quickly. All right, so taking note of our feelings in response to a trigger means that we really have to think about the range of emotions, because it's not like we're just all mad or all sad. Usually there's some mixed feelings or ambivalence. I will say this though, we can have like a cascade of emotions, but we usually have one emotion that is the strongest at any given point. And that's really the emotion we want to tease out, right? If something happens, you can feel angry and sad about it at the same time. Sad for the loss that the event caused, but angry maybe at the fact that it happened or that somebody you love and trust played a part in that. We can be angry at ourselves because we're the ones that screwed up, and hurt somebody else. But there's usually a prime emotion that's overarching. And that's the one we want to focus on. And we focus on that emotion because it's usually the one that drives our thought process and especially our behavior that follows, right? Because a thought happens in response to an event, which elicits an emotion, which then causes us to choose a specific behavior that in the therapy world we call coping. So I know we talk about coping like it's all good, right? Oh, I coped. I went for a walk. Oh, I coped. I read a book. Oh, I coped. I did some deep breathing. But you know what else is coping? Punching a wall, yelling, venting, in some cases cutting, using drugs, sleeping all day. That's coping. It's just not necessarily healthy coping, right? And so we have to acknowledge that not all coping is good. All behavior in response to a stressor is some form of coping because it's how the emotion is manifested. You follow? Right? And as a therapist, I try not to label things as all good and all bad. And I know in the mood skill sheet that I provide you through my website, it does list, in boxes, negative coping, positive coping, but in real life, that's not reality. That's, coping's a spectrum. I tell my clients I'd much rather somebody lay in bed all day than cut But I'd much actually rather, if it comes down to it, somebody cut than use methamphetamine, right? Because we're talking about harm reduction. Now we want to move, toward being proactive with the coping and learning to goal pace our coping and future pace. But that's a skill we work up toward, right? Okay, moving on. All right, so once we've identified our emotions, now we have to identify our associated thoughts when triggered, right? So usually the question I ask clients, and I'm trying to kind of pull this out of them, because this is the tricky part. This is where most people get stuck, is understanding the associated thoughts. It's not a singular thought. It's a string of thoughts and how we are interpreting an event, right? You've heard of that term lost in translation, right? Something can happen and I can have a complete different takeaway from it than you, right? So this is oftentimes, especially in family dynamics, and something's said and somebody's feelings get hurt, and then somebody goes off, right? It's because one person assumes the other person should know what they're talking about or what they're thinking, and not, as a result, they feel offended or think there's been some kind of boundary violation. But that's because oftentimes we have different scripts and expectations running in our own heads, which leads to a different interpretation because of a different frame of reference altogether, or usually some kind of combination of the three. Okay. All right. So understanding our associated thoughts to an event, especially when we're triggered, is really important. So just ask yourself, what did that mean to me? When blank happened, what did that mean to me? How did I understand, make sense, interpret the situation, right? What kind of underlying meanings was I assuming? All right. Next is the replace and exchange of the thought for a more helpful and true one. And this is really important because we want to get as close to the truth as possible when we're trying to replace our thought, and we won't always have enough evidence or facts to make an absolute assumption, right? Or an absolute statement to ourselves. But we can usually gather enough evidence to make an educated guess, right? That we're happy with. And when new evidence comes, then we can circle back and, reassess, right? But the skill here is learning to keep an open mind with it, not to be too rigid in the way we're thinking about things. So here's a hint. When we're trying to replace a thought, seek understanding, not blame. I'm going to repeat that. When we're trying to replace a thought, seek understanding, not blame. If therapy could be summed up into like one prime skill, this would probably be it. Learn to seek understanding, not blame. It reminds me of that saying in yoga, namaste. I think that's how it goes, namaste. I believe that's translated as the good in me sees the good in you, right? The good in me sees the good in you. And that's what I remember whenever I start to get judgy in my head, whether it's with myself or with someone else. I'm like, okay, so how do I see the good in somebody else? And how do I help them see the good in me in spite of the circumstance? Make sense? Works for me. And this is about showing self-compassion and compassion toward others, right? Should be simple enough, but, our human nature kind of gets in the way. All right, so that about sums it up, right? And if you have any takeaway from this, just remember, catch it, check it, change it when it comes to replacing our thoughts, right? We have to catch the thought first. That's where the thought labeling comes in that we discussed last episode. That's just really labeling our thoughts. Okay, that was mind reading, that was exaggerating, that was making mountains out of molehills, or that was negative filtering, that kind of stuff. So, you can make up your own names if you want. It doesn't really matter. You don't have to use the labels I provide and the mood scale handout, right? But, make up your own names. That was stinking thinking. That was anxious thinking. That was comparative thinking. That was, I don't know, give them fun names, whatever works for you. But the most important thing is that you have a way to kind of tag your thoughts the same way, you hashtag things on Instagram, right? Everybody knows about that. Hashtag mental health, hashtag coping, hashtag anxiety, right? So you're really just hashtagging your thoughts so that when you see it, you can catch it. Good news is, like we talked about before, is that our unhealthy thoughts are usually repetitive, which means, okay, I might have a trouble with mind reading, but you might have trouble with comparative thinking. 99.9% of the time, it's going to be the same one, which makes it really cool once you get in the habit of catching it, because then it's easy. It's like, oh, I know you. You're Joe the anxious thought, right? So then you catch it faster, which allows you to mitigate the fallout from your emotions and your subsequent behavior. Good stuff, right? Okay, so catch it, check it, change it. And if you take that and you remember the whole namaste mentality, right? Seekers, understanding, not blame, you'll be starting off on a really good foot here, right? So looking ahead, in the next episode, we will be covering the next skill, which focuses on techniques for changing unhealthy thoughts into useful ones, how to increase your helpful thoughts, right? We all want that. More thoughts that are helpful, the better. And identifying helpful thoughts, right? So we've been talking a lot about identifying unhelpful thoughts. It's equally, if not more important, to learn how to identify helpful thoughts, or the most powerful thoughts that keep us motivated, inspired, other people oriented, right? Compassionate, and balancing our thoughts with yes, but statements. All right, we'll talk more about that. That's a cool trick for helping us balance out our thought process. And we'll be talking about planning for a worry time. I know, sounds weird, right? Planning to worry, but it'll make more sense. So make sure you check out the next episode when it rolls out. And at the time I'm recording this, it's the week of Thanksgiving. So this podcast doesn't officially launch until December 5th, but I'm just trying to get some plugged in there ahead of time so that when you do start, you have some substantial information to work with. Okay? So we'll be talking about that. And if you have any questions about mental health, if there's anything you would like me to touch on in terms of content that you think I haven't gotten to, or you're worried I won't get to, please just shoot me, something on my contact page. I'll include that in the show notes for sure. Just look at the details of the podcast. I'll put a link there for the contact me. I'm very approachable and open to questions. I'm human, and I'm a therapist, so, I love questions. And I don't know the answers to everything. I never will, but I'm always happy to share what I do know. And if I don't know the answer, I will try and find it for you. Okay? Save you the work. As always, if you are in crisis, do not forget there is no shortage of help. If you're in crisis immediately, there is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255, or you can text START, S-T-A-R-T, to 741-741. All right? And you can always find mental health help through the NAMI referral helpline. That's the National Association for Mental Illness at 1-800-950-6264. Just a disclaimer, I am a psychotherapist, licensed clinical social worker, but I am not your therapist. If you need a professional, you should get one, and you can do that if you go to psychologytoday.com, therapist finder. All right, good stuff. In the meantime, keep thriving, and I will see you next episode. Take care. Happy Thanksgiving, if you're listening to this before it launches. All right, bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. to the Mental Health Toolbox Podcast. Learn more at www.thementalhealthtoolbox.com.